Summary of Frindle by Andrew Clements. Nick Allen isn't a bad kid, but he has a lot of ideas and likes to give them to his teachers to make them crazy. In 3rd grade, he talked Miss Deaver into letting the class turn the classroom into a tropical island. Then, in 4th grade, Nick learned that blackbirds make high-pitched sounds to confuse birds of prey. He also noticed that his teacher, Mrs. Avery, looked like a hawk. He and one of his friends, Janet Fisk, made high-pitched bird sounds all year to annoy Mrs. Avery, but she never caught them. For Lincoln Elementary kids, going into the 5th grade is a turning point. They don't have break anymore, they get real letter grades, and Mrs. Granger is their language arts teacher. Mrs. Granger is known for being strict and giving a lot of homework, especially for language. She is also crazy about the dictionary. Nick's folks get a letter from Mrs. Granger a few weeks before school starts. In it, Mrs. Granger says that Nick needs a good dictionary for his tasks. Nick just groans. On the first day of school, Mrs. Granger gives a word test to get things going. Nick chooses to use the teacher stopper, a question that is meant to stop teachers from giving homework, right before the period ends. He asks Mrs. Granger where the words come from that are in the books. Instead of telling him, Mrs. Granger tells Nick to find out on his own and report back to the class the next day. Nick does Mrs. Granger's word homework after school, but he doesn't want to. He then works on his report. Nick looks up dictionary in both the adult and children's encyclopedias and then comes up with one of his great ideas. The next day, Nick gives his talk in Mrs. Granger's class. Mrs. Granger likes it for the first 18 minutes, but then she seems to realize that Nick is trying to make his talk last as long as possible. She finally tells him to stop with 10 minutes left in the class. Nick doesn't stop there, though. He goes on to ask Mrs. Granger why different words have different meanings. Mrs. Granger tells Nick that he and all other English users decide what words mean. She also says that if everyone started using a different word for something, it would end up in the dictionary. Nick and Janet walk home together that afternoon. Janet finds a gold pen in the street, but Nick is too busy thinking about what Mrs. Granger said about words and why they mean what they do. When he was a small child, his parents knew he wanted to listen to music when he said Gwagala. Nick is so focused on what he's doing that he bumps into Janet and knocks her pen away. He says sorry and calls the pen a Frindle as he gives it to Janet. The next day, he goes to a store and asks the clerk for a Frindle. He has to point to a pen for her to understand what he wants. But after 6 days of kids asking for Frindles, the woman knows what Janet means when she says she wants a Frindle. Nick and his friends swear to only use the word Frindle and never say the word pen again. The next day, Nick and one of his friends act like Nick forgot his Frindle in Mrs. Granger's class. Mrs. Granger doesn't find it funny when the other kids laugh. After class, she tells Nick not to make her laugh with his ideas. Nick seems innocent, says he really did forget his Frindle, and says he won't do it again. 2 days later, everyone's class picture is taken by the school. The last picture is of the 5th grade. When the camera asks the kids to say cheese, they all say Frindle and hold up a pen. Mrs. Granger is very angry, but all the other kids at school think it's funny and start saying Frindle. This makes Mrs. Granger start giving kids detention for using Frindle, but detention with Mrs. Granger becomes a badge of honor instead of a punishment. After about a week, Mrs. Granger says that Frindle has gone too far, but Nick says that he's just putting Mrs. Granger's lessons on words to use in the real world. He doesn't change his mind when Mrs. Granger tells him that the word pen has a long and meaningful past, but Mrs. Granger doesn't seem surprised by his response. She asks Nick to sign and date the back of an envelope with a letter for him. She says she will give it to him when this is all over. The next day, one of Nick's friends suggests that they have the whole class ask Mrs. Granger for a Frindle, since she can't keep everyone in detention. That day, Mrs. Granger has 80 children, and the next day, she has 200. Mrs. Chatham, the director, chooses to talk to Nick's parents about what's going on. Mrs. Chatham tells Mrs. and Mr. Allen that the kids ruined the class picture and aren't following the rules like they used to. Mrs. Allen looks irritated and says that the whole thing seems like an exaggeration to kids trying out a new word, but Mrs. Chatham says that they need to stop Frindle for the same reason they need to stop kids from using ain't standards. When Nick says that ain't is in the dictionary, the adults don't know what to do. Mrs. Allen says it again, and Mrs. Chatham leaves soon after. Nick tells his parents that he didn't mean to be rude and that he can't stop it because it's no longer just his word. The next day, a writer named Judy Morgan hears that Lincoln Elementary is having a revolt. When Judy asks to talk to someone about the Frindle business, Mrs. Freed, the secretary, gets angry right away and sends her to see Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Chatham tells Judy that she is overreacting and that it was just a silly joke, but Judy can tell that Mrs. Chatham doesn't want to talk about it. Judy talks to Mrs. Granger next. Mrs. Granger seems sure that Frindle will soon be out of style and says that it all started with a boy named Nick Allen. Judy is walking to the parking lot when she runs into a group of kids who just got out of Mrs. Granger's punishment. All of them are excited to be a part of a movement, but tell Judy that Nick probably won't want to talk to her. The next day, Judy gets a picture of her 5th grade class in an envelope at work. On the back, someone wrote down which kid is Nick. The story that Judy wrote about Frindle is on the front page of the Westfield Gazette when it comes out on Thursday. The whole town is in a commotion. When kids in middle school and high school start using the word, Nick instantly becomes famous. Local businessman Bud Lawrence starts selling pens with the word Frindle on them and files a preliminary trademark application for the word. Alice Lunderson, who works for CBS, reads Judy's story a few days after it comes out. It gets the attention of the national CBS station in New York, and they let Alice put together a piece for the evening news. Alice talks to Mrs. Granger, who says kids need to learn that there are rules to words, and then talks to the Allen family. Nick says uncomfortably that he was just trying out what Mrs. Granger taught him, and he says that she taught him a lot about words. Nick is asked to do talks on TV and in magazines after the show airs. Bud Lawrence's sales go up, but his lawyer tells him that now that everyone in the country knows that Nick came up with the word Frindle, they'll have to make a deal with the Allen family to use it. Bud knows that getting the rights to the word will be easy when he asks Mr. Allen to come to his office to talk. Mr. Allen is tired of all the attention and wants it to stop. Mr. Allen agrees to sign a contract that gives Nick 30% of the profits from Frindle-branded products and gives Nick a check for $2,250 as his share of the first week's earnings. Nick has a secret bank account set up for him by Mr. Allen. Bud keeps sending Nick bigger and bigger checks, and the city council decides to put up a Frindle sign. Mrs. Granger keeps telling the kids to use pen, but none of them will. Nick has a hard time getting over his moment of fame. Some of his ideas start to worry him. When he learns about consumers, he thinks he can use what he's learned to get his friends to stop eating the school food until it gets better. But he doesn't tell anyone because he's afraid of getting in trouble. He also thinks that Mrs. Granger forgot about the letter she wrote to him. He goes to talk to her about it on the last day of school. She says that the Frindle thing isn't over yet, so he can't have the letter. She does tell him that she's proud of how he handled things and that he shouldn't be afraid of his big plans. Nick shakes hands with Mrs. Granger, who tells him she knows he'll do great things. Nick can now feel good about what he did and be proud of it. 2 years later, he does get students to stop eating the school food, which makes Westfield's lunch program the best in the state. Nick is in charge of the Frindle savings account when he turns 21. He gives his family money and then tries not to think about it. Also, Mrs. Granger sends him a package. The package has Mrs. Granger's letter and a new copy of Webster's College Dictionary. The dictionary has an entry for the word Frindle. It says that she's excited about Nick's new word and that she's going to play the bad guy. She writes that she loves the book because it is still useful even though things change, and it can also change and adapt to new situations. A note saying Frindle is attached to Mrs. Granger's favorite pen, which is also in the box. On Christmas morning, Mrs. Granger finds a gift and a package that looks like it was sent by the government on her front door. In the package, Mrs. Granger is congratulated and told that a former student gave $1 million to start a grant fund in her name. She thinks it's a mistake, but she looks at the gift anyway. It has a lovely gold pen in it. On the pen, it says that Mrs. Granger can call the thing by any name she wants. Nick Allen is the one who said it.
About the author. Clements was born in Camden, New Jersey. Before coming to Illinois when Andrew Clements was in the 6th grade, Clements' family lived in several places in New Jersey.
The family spent the summers on a lake in Maine, where there was no TV or phone.
Clements says that this gave him a lot of time to read. Clements went to Northwestern University to study English, and he taught writing at a few high school summer camps before deciding to become a teacher.
He went to National Louis University and got an MA in teaching.
After that, he taught 4th grade, 8th grade, and high school outside of Chicago for 7 years. During this time, he got married and had his first son. When budget cuts made it look like Clements' job wasn't safe, he and his family moved to New York City. There, he worked for a short time as a singer-songwriter before going into production. His friends in the publishing business helped him write his first children's picture books, and Clements released Frindle after working on the idea for 6 years. Since then, he's written a number of other award-winning books for kids and now lives with his wife in Maine.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.